Hey guys, Sam from Panel Precision. Today's video is going to be all about full length sizing and getting the perfect shoulder bump on a fired case. Now this video is going to be kind of the video version of my article that I wrote for panelprecision.com called Full Length Sizing for Reliable Precision. So if you're into looking at text and pictures and charts and diagrams, be sure to go check that out. I'll put the link right here in the video description. Now today's video, I'm doing the lead into it right now, but a lot of this footage was shot last fall where I started the project. I just never finished it. Now we have a new rifle. This is Jake's new competition rifle, chambered in .260 Remington. Last year's video sections have to do with his old .260 Remington. So I'll warn you right up front that a lot of the numbers you're going to see might not make sense. So I'm going to keep most of the new stuff out of it, and we'll just focus on that old stuff. As long as I'm talking about that, the numbers that we'll go over, the dimensions and things like that, are relative numbers. They're not absolute numbers. All we're looking for is a comparative number. So we're trying to change, one dimension to another dimension so it'll function in the rifle. Other than that, everything is the same. Okay, so what is full-length resizing? So full-length resizing is taking a fired case like this one and reducing the dimensions on it so that it will chamber in this chamber again, fit into the chamber with zero effort. We don't want any resistance whatsoever. Now I can take this piece of brass. This is just a fired piece of brass out of Jake's rifle. It's clean, but other than that we haven't done anything to it. And I can put it in the chamber and I can close the bolt on it. So it will function, it will go in there, but the problem is if you get anything in there at all with it, dust, dirt, a chunk of grass, a little bit of carbon, some water, just humidity and moisture in the air, you could run into problems. So what we do is we set it back, we set the shoulder back, change the dimension, make it a little bit shorter, and we reduce the sizes, so the diameters, at the web and at the shoulder down here, just to give us a little bit of insurance. Now you have to size the case. You have to do something because the neck is no longer the correct dimension to hold a bullet. So you have to run this into some kind of a die and squeeze that neck down to hold a bullet. So rather than doing a neck size only, I choose to do a full length resize. Now when I show you some of the numbers on Jake's rifle here, you'll see that it's not that big of a deal. It requires you to move the brass very little to buy yourself a lot of insurance. So we'll go back to Jake's dimensions now on his new rifle, but until then, I'm going to lead you right into talking about SAMI and how it relates to this whole resizing business. Okay, every cartridge that you can buy commercially or buy components for or buy a rifle off the rack for or whatever is going to have some standardized dimensions. You're going to have a minimum and a maximum spec, and those are set and stored by SAMI, which is Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute. And what that does is it allows Remington to chamber up a rifle and sell it on the shelf for a .260 Remington. It allows Lapua to make .260 Remington brass. It lets Hornady make its own .260 Remington loaded ammunition, and it lets Redding make a set of sizing dies for .260 Remington. And in theory, all of them should work together, and they should all function within those specifications for the cartridge. So the way it relates to this whole project is that when you buy a piece of brass, brand new brass, it's going to be the smallest dimension that it'll ever be. So when they made this piece of brass, it should come in at the minimum end of the spec for a .260 Remington chamber size. Now when they make a chamber reamer, they want, especially an outfit like Remington or Savage or Winchester or whoever, they want to ensure that no matter where you get your ammunition or your brass, that it will fit into their chamber and function. So the chamber is going to be a little bit bigger. It's going to be towards the maximum size of that overall dimension of the cartridge. And they do have different specs for chambers than they do for ammunition and brass and things like that, but they're designed to work together safely. In the middle of all that, we have a sizing die. So if you reload, you want to be able to size the case to go back into that chamber, hold a bullet, and fire again. So the sizing die is going to be sized, is going to be produced just a little bit smaller than the chamber it's designed to work with. So you'll have the smallest one will be the new piece of brass, the biggest one will be the chamber, and the sizing die is going to be in between. That's pretty much it. Okay, let's go over some terms and definitions so that we're all on the same page. The first thing we'll talk about is headspace. Now, we aren't setting our headspace here with a sizing die or a piece of brass. Headspace is something that's already been set when whoever chambered the barrel set the headspace. So what it is, it's the distance between the head of the bolt where it contacts the head of the case and the forward leading edge inside the chamber of the barrel. That's your headspace. It's set. There's nothing you can do about changing headspace other than go back in and cut it differently with a reamer. So you know, when guys start talking about headspace, I think they get confused thinking that the cartridge is setting the headspace. It isn't. What we're going to do is we're going to make that piece of brass work within the confines of our headspace. So when we start talking about headspace as it relates to full-length sizing and especially shoulder bump, what we really want to say is that we're going to set back the shoulder, we're going to set back the case, and we're going to shorten it back up so that it has clearance within our headspace dimensions of our chamber. Okay, then when we talk about full-length sizing, a lot of guys like to separate full-length sizing from the shoulder bump. You can't really do that. Once you take a piece of brass that's been fired in the chamber and put it into a sizing die that has a slightly smaller dimension than that chamber, you're going to be moving some brass. So this brass, as it goes into the die, is actually going to start elongating, you know, because it has to go somewhere, and it's not just compressing into itself. So it elongates a little bit, and I think a lot of people have problems with their brass because of this. They don't get all the way to the bump. So if you were to put this into your die and set it up with no bump, and all you'd have to do really is get the forward leading edge here of the shoulder all the way into where it's sizing a little bit, you actually end up with a longer case than when you started, when you're measuring at the datum line on the shoulder. So it physically will not go back into your gun at that point. So what you have to do is you have to get that piece of brass all the way into your die enough that the shoulder is contacting the shoulder inside the die. And once that happens, then you can start to get a shoulder bump and a complete sizing all the way back to the web. And one of the biggest concerns that comes up from guys who don't know if they want a full length size or if they want a neck size only or if they don't want to do anything at all, which you can't do. You have to do something to fire the case again. One of the biggest concerns is case head separation. Everybody thinks they're going to have a case head separation if you full length size your brass. I can tell you from a long time of experience that case head separations are not the normal thing, and they shouldn't happen when you're using stuff that works right and using a process that works right. So if you have a chamber that's headspaced correctly within the spec, you know, the SAMI spec for the cartridge you're working on, if you buy a piece of brass or use a loaded cartridge that has a piece of brass that is manufactured correctly to work within the chamber you're messing with, and you set back your shoulders just enough to give yourself good easy feeding into the chamber, you'll never have a case head separation. It's not a normal thing. I have fired pieces of brass up over 20 times before, setting the shoulder back on them 2/1000ths every single time, full length sizing the entire case, and I've never had a case head separation. I've never even seen a case head separation. So, you know, it's not a normal thing. Full length sizing by itself, done correctly, will not cause case head separation. So if you want to think about the dimensions we're working with here to give you a better idea, I'm going to take this dollar bill and I'm going to measure the thickness of it with my caliper. So we've got 4.5 thousandths. So 0.0045 is the thickness of a dollar bill. We're going to push the shoulder back. We're going to compress this case down 2 thousandths. So less than half the thickness of a dollar bill. So just put it in perspective. We're not really working the brass all that much. Alright guys, so if you look at these three cases, I just I basically just sectioned these with like a grinding disc this morning, just to kind of show you what they look like inside. Now the three numbers of the three things at the top there, those are dimensional thicknesses. So that's the thickness of the brass as measured with a ball mic right here at the neck. So it's the thickness of the brass. You can see Remington is 13 thousandths, Alpha is 14 and a half, and Lapua is 15. Now that's just basically the biggest part of the dimension I could find. They all have a little bit of variations in thicknesses, but that's measured in the 10 thousandths, and I'm not really worried too much about it. If you look at that, obviously the Lapua brass is the thickest, the Remington is the thinnest. So when we start talking about die dimensions and dies and how they work, that'll come into play. But the biggest thing I want to show you now is to follow up with the case head separation thing. And if you look at all of these cases here, you can see the thicknesses, how they run up, and they get a little bit thicker up here by the web, and then you have a real thick head on them, and then they thin out down here in the neck, shoulder area. That's how a case should look. That's how a case is supposed to be. It gets a little bit thicker towards the top and a little bit thinner towards the bottom. Now the stuff at the top is supposed to stay hard and not change at all. The stuff at the bottom is supposed to stay relatively pliable. So you know, guys talk about annealing, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep this lower end of the case somewhat pliable so that it has all the properties that we need in a brass case to hold the bullet, release the bullet, seal the chamber, and resize it so we can use it again. But if you look at all these cases, they've all been fired multiple times in full-length size. So that piece of Remington brass was fired 8 times in my Savage LRP and pushed back, you know, 2 thousandths to 3 thousandths every single time in that chamber, and it's still fine. You can see there's no thinning on the brass at all. The second one in line is an Alpha. That was fired, I think, 3 or 4 times in my 260 comp rifle and pushed back 2 thousandths every time. The Lapua brass, or the Lapua case on the end, is one that I had in my comp rifle, and that one was fired 7 times. So, you know, I don't have any 20 times fired pieces of brass that have cross-section, but I suspect they're going to look just like that. Okay, let's go over a couple of the tools that I'm going to use here. If you don't want to use these tools, then there's nothing I can do for you, because if you can't measure what we're talking about, you can't really apply it. I highly recommend that you get a pair of calipers. I prefer electronic calipers simply because they're easy to zero with a comparator on them and then work with the real number that you're messing with. A dial caliper will work, you know, a manual caliper, but you're going to have to do a little bit of math because you can't zero it with a comparator in place. These are Mitutoyos. This is just a 6-inch model. I've had this, I don't know, 12 years, I guess, and I've had 0 problems with it. It reads down to 10 thousandths. For most of what we're going to be doing, you only need to get to 1 thousandths resolution, which is the 3rd decimal place over. 10 thousandths, we'll use it, but it's not that critical. The other thing we're going to be using a lot is a comparator. So this is a comparator insert, the stainless piece. This is from Sinclair. It goes into a comparator body, and then it clamps onto the jaw of my caliper. So now I can measure between this point and that point. So all I have to do is turn it on and zero it. So now this is the new 0 from here to the forward edge of that. So as I move out, it's maintaining that 0 and coming back. So those are the 2 biggest tools that I use for setting up dies. Okay, so what the comparator does for us is it allows us to measure the case at a specific point instead of just measuring end to end. So what we're looking for is the dimension between the head and somewhere right in the face of that shoulder where the angle starts to come down. So these comparators are shaped with the same shoulder angle as the case you're working with. So a 260, a comparator for a 260, this is a size 20 from Sinclair. For a 260 will probably work for 243, and I believe the dimension on the inside is big enough around to use it for a 308. So anything that has the same shoulder dimension or angle of my 260 is probably going to fit in that comparator. So it's not a big deal to have, you know, I mean, if you could make the comparator work for you consistently for a bunch of different cartridges, then have at her. But, you know, I prefer to have a comparator for every shoulder angle that I'm working on. But anyway, that just fits in there. And now we can measure from that shoulder to the head of the case and come up with our number. So we have 1.5695. Now remember I was talking about the thousands versus 10,000s? What we're really concerned about is the third one over from the decimal point, so that 9. What I want to end up doing is making that a 7 after I run this piece of brass through my full-length sizing die. But that's how we measure it, right there. We know it came out of the chamber, fired at 1.5695. When I get done running it through my sizing die, I want that dimension to be 1.5675. And what that does is it gives me 2 thousandths of clearance within my headspace of my rifle. So this headspace on this chamber is a little bit different than my 260 comp rifle was. This is the barrel that my son is using to compete with this year. They're both sized in 260 Remington. I could put his size case into my chamber, but I can't put my size case into his chamber because my headspace on my rifle is longer than the headspace on this rifle. But with this tool, I know exactly what I have, and I can set up the die to give myself exactly 2 thousandths of shoulder bump, which is enough to get good, reliable function out of any chamber. A lot of guys ask, do you need a special die to make special kinds of ammo? Well, you know, the kinds of ammo that I use and the kinds of rifles that I shoot, you probably don't need anything special whatsoever. I've used a lot of different dies over the years, but for the entire time I've been shooting precision rifles and long-range stuff, I've been using Redding dies. Now that doesn't mean that the other manufacturers don't make dies that you can use. It just means that I haven't been using them for no particular reason other than I know exactly what I'm getting when I get a Redding die. So the biggest thing I would look for in a die is that, number one, it needs to size your piece of brass to the correct dimensions. I haven't had any problems with any dies from any manufacturers doing that. I think most of the problems that guys have come from the chamber of the rifle not being the correct dimension, or them not understanding the relationship between the die and the chamber, nor how to measure it. So, you know, as far as whatever die you want to use, try whatever you have and see what you end up with. The biggest thing I would recommend is if the finish is kind of rough in your die, polish it. You know, make it nice and shiny and smooth so that you get less resistance when you're pushing the case up into it. Now these two dies are the two dies that I use the most. Of the two dies, the one that I use 90% of the time at least is the die right here on the right. And that is a Redding Type S full-length bushing die. And what they did with this die is they have the blank, which is that body, and they cut it to a 260 Remington body and shoulder size, but only left a shelf inside that's oversized so that it'll hold this bushing. So this bushing, you know, you can buy whatever size you want. They come in 1,000th increments. So whatever size neck you want, you just order a bushing for it. Now I've got videos on how to decide which bushing you want, so we're not going to get into that too heavy. This one is just a standard Redding full-length sizing die, and that one is just cut to a the minimum chamber size or minimum sizing die size for a 260 Remington, and they made the neck small enough, the dimension small enough, so that it will work with Remington brass and Lapua brass. So you can see it, if you make it work for Remington brass, then it's going to size the Lapua brass much more than it needs to be sized. And the way they control the neck diameter on a full-length sizing die is through the use of this expander right here. So this round button on the end of that stem, when you push the case up into the die, is going to size the neck way down, and then when you pull it back out of the die, this button, or an expander, is going to open that neck up to the dimension that they set for that case. So generally speaking, you're going to end up with 1 to 1.5 thousandths smaller diameter than the bullet on the inside of the neck if you use the expander. Now on a bushing die, you can use the expander or not use the expander. You can set your neck dimension just by using the bushing. And I've done that for years. When I start sizing, I'll tell you what I'm doing differently now simply because of the environment that I'm shooting in. But you can either run the expander or not run the expander with the bushing die. With a standard full-length sizing die, you have to have the expander in place. Unless you send your die off and have it honed to the same dimension as the diameter of your neck on your brass that you want. But you know, I don't know anybody that does that. But it's an option. Get whatever die you want. As long as it works, it works. I don't think this part of the process is going to make too much of a difference as far as precision, accuracy, or reliability goes. Okay, before we move into the segment that shows me actually sizing brass, I thought I'd just touch on the subject again of keeping everything clean and well lubricated. If you do that, this whole thing becomes easier. So keep the brass clean before it goes into the die. Make sure your die is clean. Polish the inside dimension or inside surface of the die if you want to. I know I have been, and it's made a big difference in the amount of effort it takes to run a case through the die, as well as polishing that expander button now that I've gone back to using the expander button in my die. Now you can use whatever you want to lubricate, you can use whatever you want to clean the brass. I don't care. I still use the same stuff that I've been using for almost 20 years. So I have that information is on the website in my tool list. There's an article about what I use as far as tools, and my step-by-step guide, how I reload, how I do everything. It's all out there to look at. But anyway, keep everything clean, keep everything well lubricated, and all of this will work much better. Okay, our brass is clean, our die is clean. I've lubed my cases. I use Hornady One Shot. It works really well, and it's easy to do big batches like this. The next thing we'll talk about is, we'll get back to the Headspace thing. So an analogy that I'm going to use here when you look at these parts is the shell holder. If you just imagine that the shell holder is like the bolt face in our rifle. So this is the end that the case is supported by in the head. So if that was in the rifle, that would be your bolt face. And as you chamber this, you're going to be running that into the chamber of your rifle, and we'll just call the die the chamber. So if you remember when we were talking about SAMI specs and everything, the die is designed to be a little bit smaller than a chamber for any given cartridge. So what it allows you to do is to take a little bit of measurement off this case, size it down a little bit so that it'll slip easily into our rifle's chamber when we go to fire it. So what we're going to do is we're going to screw this into the press. We're going to put our shell holder in place, and then our case is going to go there, and we're just going to move the ram up into the die until we get to the right measurement that gives us a shoulder bump. And remember, we have to make contact, the case has to make contact with the shoulder inside the die to get that shoulder set back. And even if you go for a zero bump, in other words, you don't want any additional clearance in there, you still have to get to that point to offset the amount of growth from the case getting squeezed into that die. So it's going to elongate just a little bit. As that case gets squeezed down inside the die, it's going to move forward a little bit, and you still need to come all the way to that shoulder and at least kiss it so that your case will get back into your rifle. So you want to end up with at least a zero shoulder bump after you go through a full-length sizing die. Now I recommend getting at least 0.02 of bump. Now all those cases that I showed you, they had all been sized 0.02 for however many firings. You aren't going to hurt anything. And on top of that, you aren't going to hurt accuracy. If you guys watch my videos, see my Instagram, all that stuff, all those pictures, the groups and all of us shooting at long range and all that stuff, this is exactly how I've done it forever. So you know, I get pretty good accuracy out of it, so there's no reason why you shouldn't either. Alright, so let's just move on. We've got our bolt face right there. This is our chamber. Now with any luck at all, nothing changed here, because now I'm in a hurry. I get this brass done for Jake's rifle. So what I like to do is I start off when I'm setting up a die, I'll start off, I'll run it down, so I won't have a case in. I'll run the ram up, and I'll just screw that die down until it touches it. That's my starting point. And then I'll back it off. If I don't know what my chamber dimensions are, I don't know anything at all about this rifle or this die, I'll back it off about 1/8 of a turn, and I'll just finger tighten my lock ring in place. And then I'm going to take one case and I'm going to run it up in there, and I'm going to measure my shoulders, see if I got any bump. If I didn't get any bump, I'm going to turn that down back to 1/8 of a turn, and I'm going to run the case back in it again. Now, between those two throws through the die, I'm going to lube the case again because I want it to go into the die the same way it went in the first time. And basically just keep doing that until you get your bump. You don't have to do a new case every time. You can use one piece of brass the entire time. And then with the piece of brass, what I'll do is, once I'm sure that I like the bump with the first piece, I'll take it out. This is still, every time I moved it, I just finger tighten that lock ring. I'll take another piece, I'll run it up in there, I'll make sure that that is tight, and I'll lock down my lock ring with the piece of brass in place. And basically what that does is it squares everything up to the ram, it squares the lock nut up to the top of the press with the case in it and everything. And then when I'm done, I'm going to check 2 more just to make sure I'm still getting the same amount of bump, and then I'm just going to run with it. Now this one, this one, I'm hoping is in the right place. Now, remember I was telling you that my 260 comp rifle has a different headspace than Jake's 260. Jake's 260 is short headspace, so we only put about 1/1000 to 1.5 thousandths worth of clearance between the go gauge and our bolt face. So I won't ever do it again. Some guys do it so that you take a new piece of brass, throw it in the chamber, and it's almost like a glove fit right off the bat. And then you don't have to hardly move anything when you're sizing and doing all this stuff. I don't like doing that. It makes it hard to chamber that first round. It makes it hard to size them after they come out. Some cases you have to get that case all the way into the die so that you get some sizing action on the web of the case. So anyway, this is very short headspace. So what I have to do is run it all the way in, and I'm actually camming over. Now a lot of guys, when they get to that point, they think they're out of die adjustment. Not the case at all. You're going to have some spring in that case, quite a bit of spring as a matter of fact. So if you hit that bottom, don't stop, just keep going. And as the case goes up in there, it's going to push. You'll actually feel the shoulder when it hits that die. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this case up, see what we get. You'll actually feel it after time and gain a little bit of experience. You'll feel the difference between just sizing a piece of brass and actually getting to that shoulder contact with the die. And you'll feel it hit that shoulder in the die and start to compress. Okay, so I've got 2 thousandths now of shoulder bump exactly, which is exactly where I want it to be. So basically my last setting on this with the lock ring tightened down like I described, and then I took it off, I cleaned it, whatever, as long as it stays in this station. This is a turret press, so each one of these is going to have a little bit of difference, a little bit of tolerances, but if you leave them in the same place, you'll generally be okay on your die setting. Now, if I needed more clearance, in other words, if this stayed 1.5685 or 1.5695 because I didn't hit the bump, I would simply loosen that, and I would turn this just a very slight amount, and then lock that with my fingers again, run a case up in it, and check it. Because once you get to that contact point with the shoulder and the die, it doesn't take very much to start pushing that back. Very tiny amounts. So, I mean, just barely moving that die clockwise closer to the shell holder. And you want to check it very often, and you want to maintain the same amount of lubrication on your case the whole time. Alright, so now that I know I'm good there, let me run another one in. Okay, remember I told you I was going to tell you something I was doing a little differently now. I used to be a big proponent, well I still am a big proponent of not using the expander in a bushing die because you don't need it. However, if you're shooting over a concrete apron, and especially if you're on an elevated position like shooting off of a barricade or something, and your brass is falling 3 or 4 feet to the ground right onto the concrete, you're going to end up with a bunch of dent and necks. So I used to just use this expander die. This is just a Sinclair expander die with a mandrel in it, and it's designed to punch out necks so that you can neck turn them to get, you know, consistent neck thickness. But it works really well just to clean up the interior size of a neck. So if I had one dented case and I saw it, I would just put a little bit of lubricant on the inside of it and run it up through this expander, throw it in with the rest of the brass, and then just run it through my bushing die with no expander. And that works just fine. But I was finding that I was getting a bunch of brass that had dented necks, so that was starting to get tedious, and I caught myself not seeing them a couple of times. So I made the decision to pull the expander out, polish it up, and leave it in the die. Now I checked, you know, I think I sized 10, yeah, I sized 10 with just a bushing, and I sized 10 with the expander, polished and everything, and then I loaded up all 20 of those, and then I tested the two different methods. So one with the expander, one without the expander. I tested the velocity and the accuracy, and there was no difference between the two. So this won't hurt anything if you keep everything lubed up. Now the bushing that's in place is a 292 bushing, and running it back over that expander, I'm maintaining my 292 neck. So there isn't a whole lot being done other than straightening out the inside of that neck where it's been caved in a little bit at the mouth as I come back over that expander. So now I'm just going to do a few more here. Measure it. Now you remember I said that I always make a little sticky note where I put all my dimensions. All I did was I took the sticky note from the last one and stuck it over here, and everything matches, of course. Nothing has changed. Okay, before I get too far down this road, let's talk about belted magnums real quick. The big difference between a regular bottleneck cartridge like a 260 and a 300 Win Mag like a belted cartridge like this one is how they headspace. So remember we talked about the headspace is the difference between, or it's the space, the amount of clearance, the space it takes up between the bolt face and whatever stops the forward motion of the case. So on a bottleneck case, what stops the forward motion of this case is right there, the slope of that shoulder. So as it goes in and hits that chamber, that's where it stops. So our headspace is the amount of literally the dimension from that head to where it stops. Now on a belted magnum, the headspace is measured off the leading edge of the belt. So from the bolt face to the front edge of that belt, that's your headspace. They're not headspaced off the shoulders when they start out fresh and new. So what we're going to do with the belted magnum, or what I do with the belted magnum, is you headspace it correctly. So like my 300 Win Mag one of my first projects on a lathe, we headspace with 3 thousandths of clearance on the go gauge. So when I chamber a brand new piece of brass in there and fire it, it fires and fills up the chamber, and that shoulder makes contact in the shoulder of the chamber. So now this piece of brass has formed like a glove to my chamber. Well, there's 3 thousandths of clearance right here, so when I fired it and it pushed out there, it came back this way. So now if I just put that back in the chamber, the leading edge of that belt is no longer contacting the leading edge of the belt recess inside the chamber. Now it's actually supported from the case head to the shoulder. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure it just like I just did with these 260 cases with a comparator that matches that shoulder angle, and I'm going to set my 300 Win Mag die up just to bump that shoulder 2 thousandths. And what that'll do essentially is it'll give me 1 thousandths clearance behind the belt here and maintain my 2 thousandths clearance across the belt here, or across the case head here. Make sense? So now the next time we fire it and I push this into the chamber, the plunger ejector, the spring-loaded ejector, is going to be pushing that case And where it's going to stop, what's going to limit the forward motion, is going to be the shoulder inside the chamber instead of the belt. Belted magnums are no different than bottleneck cartridges as long as the rifle is head spaced correctly. You can set this up for a 1 to 2 thousandths bump on the shoulder, and instead of being on the belt as your head spacing index next time, or where it stops going into the chamber, now your shoulder is actually contacting just like a bottleneck cartridge. And I suppose the follow-up question would be, how many firings can I expect off of a belted mag before I get a case head separation? I have no idea. I fired a piece of Gunworks brass that I'm doing a review on 20 times out of my 300 Win Mag, all in the span of a couple of days. Every single time I fired it, I set it back 2 thousandths, just like I'm describing here, and kept really good notes of how the dimensions either stayed the same or changed as the brass work hardened while I was firing it. I didn't have to anneal that piece of brass until the 11th firing. Well, at the end of 20 firings, everything was still fine. Primer pocket's tight, case is still sizing back, it still goes into my chamber, the case head didn't separate and fall off and blow up, everything was fine. And that was with a hot load. That was right at the edge of pressure. So, you know, I've had other belted magnums, same thing, with Winchester brass, Hornady brass, and Weatherby brass. And I fired them, you know, 8 to 12 times and never had a problem. So it's not inherently different to run a belted magnum through a die than what I just showed you here with my 260 brass. Alright, I'll touch on the whole case head separation thing again. I still maintain that it is not a normal thing, and everything I've ever heard about it has always been anecdotal. In other words, it doesn't even happen to other people very much. Now, one thing I can remember now that I think about it is a buddy of mine is developing a cartridge, and he had somebody make a batch of brass for him to try in it. He got 2 or 3 firings out of it and then had a violent case head separation inside the chamber. So he took the other pieces of brass that had been fired the same amount of times, and he shaved them down just like I showed you on that 260 brass, and the brass was so thin, it actually looked like it was thinner up towards the head than it did down by the shoulder. That's not right. So that was crappy brass. The other times I've heard of case head separations have always been, you know, like I said before, anecdotal. So you see it on Facebook or you hear about it at a match, but you don't ever really see it. And, you know, most of the times that you do hear about it, it's always crappy brass, or if you ask the guy, how much were you setting the shoulder back on that, he doesn't even know. So, you know, I'll tell you, just from my experience in I've used everything from the Remington brass in the 260. I've used, just in 260, I've used Remington, ADG, Alpha, and Lapua brass. Just in 260, and I've never had a problem. As far as belted magnums go, which is where you get the most stretch that I've seen in a case in the first firing, I've used Weatherby, Winchester, Remington, Gunworks, ADG. I think that's it, but there might have been more. And I've fired those, you know, the ones I remember. I shot that Gunworks brass 20 times last fall. I shot all of my Winchester brass leading up to that review. All had 9 firings on them when I rotated them out and started using Gunworks. And there was no failures, 0 failures. I've used Hornady brass in 300 Weatherby. I got 12 firings out of that. Weatherby brass, I don't remember. I think that was in the 300 Weatherby, obviously. Remington was a 7 Remington. I've never had a case head separation, ever. Gas guns, bolt guns, anything. So anyway, I'll give you a little demonstration of what the numbers might look like by showing you the dimension differences between new brass, fire brass, and size brass in Jake's rifle here. Okay guys, this is pretty self-explanatory, and like I was telling you before, none of the shoulder length, which is the dimension from the case head out to that comparator, those numbers don't look anything like what I showed you in the video in Jake's old barrel. But keep in mind, we were obviously running with a different barrel, it was very short headspace, and I was using a different comparator insert. So all these things are comparative, so make sure you're using the same tools and keeping really good notes on all this stuff. But anyway, This is a pretty good example. The Alpha Munitions brass has actually been the longest brass I've ever used in a 260 chamber. So right off the bat, it's not growing as much as some of the other brands that I've used. So from a new piece of brass at 1.571, it only grew by 4 thousandths in the firing. And then we only pushed it 2 thousandths back. So that, that piece of brass is pretty pampered. It's not going to be moved very much. Now the overall length is just the overall length, literally from the case head out to the mouth. That's not really an accurate number on new. I mean it is, but I actually trimmed that to 2.020 before we fired it. So the fired length is 4.5 thousandths shorter, and that's because the brass moves and forms into that chamber. And then when we size it, it pushes back out to 2.019. Now the web diameter is the fattest part up by the rim of the case. That is something that you definitely want to get a little sizing action on to make it easier to chamber, especially when you've got water or dust or dirt. You can see that it grew by 2.5 thousandths from the new to fired, and then we pushed it back by 1. The shoulder diameters down before the shoulder and the neck come together, so that junction down there, the last big diameter of the case. New was 453, fired was 4555, and then we pushed it back in the die to the original shoulder diameter. That's another one that comes up bigger in the Alpha brass than any of the other ones I've used. So anyway, that I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing, especially for case longevity, so long life. You're not really. I mean, look at these numbers, and if you remember that dollar bill is 4.5 thousandths thick. Look at the dimensions on there. You can see nothing's changing very much, but it definitely makes a difference on how easy that case will chamber if you have any kind of crap on it, any kind of bad conditions, basically. Neck OD, we've gone over picking neck bushings and everything. There's a breakdown of it. The new brass was obviously too tight for my liking, so I ran it over an expander to bring it out to 292, and then we fired it. Got 297 on the fired case, and then sized it back down to 292 with the 292 bushing and the factory expander in place. So if you keep that all polished up nice, it works pretty well. And then down at the bottom, that's a Redding Type S full-length bushing die. It's the same one that I used in the video with just a little bit different setting on it and a different press and everything with a 292 bushing in it. But anyway, there's the breakdown of what a piece of brass goes through when it gets fired in Jake's 260 Remington and then sized in that Redding die. Alright guys, well that's about it. That's about all I know about full-length resizing. If you want more in-depth information on it, I recommend going and reading that article. It's much easier to sit down and write about this stuff than it is to talk about it, because I don't even remember half the stuff that I might be telling you. The whole point is to keep this simple. There's no reason to overthink resizing your brass. Obviously you want it to be reliable. You want that case to go right in the chamber like it should, so you can fire the cartridge, and you don't want to give up any accuracy over it. And it's been my experience that you aren't going to give up any accuracy at all. A good example would be this group right here. This was fired out of my new 6.547 barrel. That is sized brass, done exactly the same way I just showed you with Jake's 260. Jake has fired groups just like this out of this barrel. It's, I see guys all the time saying they're chasing the utmost accuracy by neck sizing their brass. And what is utmost accuracy? I mean, if you can shoot a quarter minute in a field gun, laying down bipod in a rear bag, I don't know what I'd be chasing. So anyway, this is the same process I use for everything, for my extreme long range guns like my Canyon rifle and 338 Edge, right down to my Seiko 300 Win Mag factory gun and 300 Win Mag. So it works for all of them. Just keep in mind Headspace, what the association is between your new brass, your fire brass, your chamber, and your sizing die. Invest in those measuring tools. You can't do this without them. You can't just follow the die directions when you get the die that comes in the box, screw it down, and then as long as it chambers in your rifle, you're okay. You have no idea how much you push that case back. So just get the tools, invest in the tools, and you will completely understand this once you start measuring them. But anyway, be sure to go check out that article. If you need any other help reloading, all of the little details for the rest of my process is all already on video. I just wanted to keep this all about sizing. So anyway, check it out. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.